Hey everyone, this is Theo from Headphones.com, and today I have a comparison review for you guys of the Astell Kern SE180 versus the SE200. The SE200 was a bit of an industry first in that it sported two separate DAC chips for two distinct sound signatures. But in many respects, the SE180 aims to compete with the SE200 in that it sports swappable modules so that you have multiple options later down the line. So today I'm going to be answering the question of which one you should buy. Let's take a look. So one of the first things that makes a statement about the Astell Kern DAPs is of course their elegant, visually appealing designs and their superb build quality. I really cannot think of another manufacturer at this time point that has Astell Kern matched for their build quality. Every little line is so cleanly cut on their DAPs and just meshes together so well. The only issue that I would really point out with this is that the edges on their DAPs tend to be very sharp, so I would exercise caution when holding these DAPs. And I would probably recommend picking up their leather cases, which are unfortunately sold separately. Something else that caught me off guard was the size of the SE180 in particular. It is a very substantial DAP in hand. It certainly inspires a sense of confidence, but do be aware that it is pretty heavy. I want to say it clocks in at 380 grams versus the SE200's 270 grams or so, something like that. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the other hardware characteristics. On the SE200, you have a pretty standard button setup on the left side. This here is your power button, and then over here you have three playback buttons for forward, backwards, and play pause. And then atop, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. Because you have two separate DAC chips, there are two each of 2.5mm and 3.5mm ports for each separate DAC chip. Now once again, the SE180 switches things up. Instead of three separate playback buttons, it utilizes a single one on the side here. That is a pretty sweet way of consolidating the buttons if you ask me, and my only consideration that I would point out is that it is flush, so it's a little bit harder to actuate. Something else pretty classy about the Astell Kern DAPs, just in general, are their volume wheels, and very nice sense of tactile feedback. And in addition to that, they also have integrated LEDs, which will change color depending on the file type that is being played. Once again, I personally think that's a little bit of a gimmick, but I can see the appeal here, and it certainly does lend to the elegance that these sort of DAPs tend to exude. For more standard characteristics that both DAPs share, on the bottom you have USB-C charging ports and then slots for micro SD cards. Internal memory consists of 256 gigabytes for each DAP, which is pretty solid if you ask me, and you might not even need to make use of micro SD cards depending on the size of your library. I believe claimed battery life is 10 hours for both DAPs. Running the SE180 off my Andromeda 2020, I clocked, I think, 50% drained in 5 hours. You can, however, expect the battery to drop quicker if you're using the screen to choose songs and other stuff like that. For screen size, I believe the SE200 has a 1280 by 720 screen, while the SE180 has a 1920 by 1080 screen. So the SE180 actually has a higher resolution screen, although taking advantage of it might prove cumbersome, which is something I will explore shortly. But of course, looks only get you so far, and in terms of software, I would say that the A&K DAPs tend to be a little bit more middling, at least these two DAPs in particular. All of the Astell Kern DAPs, they used a stripped version of Android that has been optimized for solely listening. And whatever CPUs Astell Kern is using in their DAPs, particularly the SE180, I can't speak for all of them of course, is just not the greatest. You can sort of tell that as I stack on more tasks with the DAP and sort of run through more common things like the playlists, that the RAM on the SE180 is sort of running out, and it's visually obvious to me. I want to point out also that these are all just standard FLAC files. There is nothing else going on with the files that I put on this device. As another example of what I am talking about, here's the new menu bar at the bottom, and you can see that it visually lags behind the, the top visually lags behind the bottom and vice versa if we do this. It's 2021, and if you're asking me personally, this level of performance is simply not acceptable, even for a niche product. Just to make a point, there is plenty of stuff like the iBasso DX300, the Hibi R8, and the FIO M11, all of which are DAPs of comparable or less cost, running Snapdragon 660s, which isn't even a state-of-the-art chip. Oh yeah, and installing apps is also a bit of a cumbersome process on the Astell Kern DAPs. You're going to have to download the APK file on your computer, and then you're going to have to transfer it over manually to the DAP and install it from there. While you'll be able to install most popular streaming apps using this method, do be aware that you'll need to manually update the apps using this process as well. Furthermore, due to the aging nature of the Android OS being used on the Astell Kern DAPs, I have seen multiple reports on HeadPhi of the native title app not being able to run, among other issues. To their credit, Astell Kern is aware of the issue, and they have released a statement that they are working on a fix. Hopefully support for streaming remains intact in the future, as I think that this is a pretty critical feature for many listeners these days. Taking a look at the stock player itself, it really has most of the things that I think most listeners would want. I really had no complaints on this front, and at this point I think it is pretty well dialed in. And then you also have an equalizer, which I will show you here. It's a little bit finicky at times, especially at top when you're trying to adjust them. I don't recommend using the top to adjust the EQ bands. And speaking of the EQ bands, I believe there are no less than 20 bands throughout. So it's not quite a parametric equalizer, but you do have a good variety of options. And if you're going to make use of the equalizer bands, I would definitely make use of this menu on the bottom instead, which is a lot less susceptible to being accidentally pressed. Okay, so let's talk about the most important part of this review, which is obviously how these DAPs sound. But first, I do want to drop a few quick disclaimers. First, the differences that I hear between sources do not tend to be major, although I will definitely attest to differences existing. 2, burn-in is generally not a consideration in my assessment, although per A&K's recommendation, I did burn in the SE180 for 50 hours before assessing it. Well, no, I assessed it first, and then I burned it in, and then I assessed it again after. And then 3, I used a variety of transducers in my assessment, including my U12T, the Moondrop Blessing 2, and the Campfire Andromeda 2020. Okay, so that aside, let's talk about the SE200. So on the left side, you have an AKM chip. And honestly, I was really impressed with this side when I first heard it. It presents a more traditional hi-fi sound, so there's an emphasis on the upper mid-range and the treble regions accordingly for a more bright forward presentation. The bass is tight, the mid-range is transparent, and the treble is where it stumbles a little bit, I think. It's a little bit splashier, a little bit brighter than I like, and just in general, the presentation comes off as more digital, more etched in decay, and not particularly natural. But again, if this is the type of sound that you're after, a more forward, more transparent presentation, then I think that this side is an apt fit. Now moving on to the right side of the SE200, this is more reminiscent of what I've come to expect from A&K's other DAPs. It is a more downward sloping sound signature that sort of dips the upper mid-range and pulls back the treble regions. In foodie terms, this is pretty much the auditory equivalent of eating a bunch of chocolate brownies and then maybe feeling a little bit sick afterwards from all the sugar. The transients on this side lean quite rich, and just in general, I do get the impression that it sounds a little bit forced, if you will. I would say decay leans more towards the textured side of things, which is a good thing, I suppose, and it lends to what some might call a more velvety presentation. Now, personally, I have to admit that I am not a big fan of this side, but I do see why this sound signature might appeal to some listeners. As you can see, the SE200 separate DAC chips present two sides of the coin. They are pretty much polar opposites in many respects. But if you wanted something in between, that's where the SE180 comes in. Tonally, I would say it is more reminiscent of the right side of the SE200, so that more downward sloping sound signature, but then it also ports over some of the more intangible qualities of the left side of the SE200's AKM chip. That in mind, I have to admit that I am not a big fan of the SE180 sound signature. The transients in the bass and the mid-range, they sound quite thin and sort of splayed, maybe plasticky is the better descriptor, which is a pretty stark contrast to the right side of the SE200, which has very rich transients. And then moving into the treble, I want to say that the treble started sounding a little bit more brittle and more bright over time, over the period of the burn-in, although I won't attest to that confidently, of course. So yeah, in general, I wasn't a big fan of the SE180 sound signature, at least not with the stock module. And this is where sort of the benefit of the modularity comes into play. Hopefully later down the line, A&K can release something, a module that is, that better suits my preferences. For technical performance, I would say that the SE200 definitely has the edge between the two DAPs, and it's a pretty considerable one, especially with the left side, the AKM DAC chip. The left side has excellent resolution and detail retrieval, whereas the right side I would say has excellent detail retrieval, but suffers more on the front of sheer clarity due to the more downward sloping sound signature. I would say that the SE180 in general falls slightly behind the right side of the SE200. Something that I want to praise about the A&K DAPs just in general is that they have remarkably dark backgrounds. And this is in the sense that instruments sort of pop and sync on the soundstage in a very alluring manner. That being said, for a sense of soundstage size, I would say that the A&K DAPs tend to be more concerned with precision than they are a sense of grandiose. So smaller stage sizes in general, but with a good sense of layering ability and positional accuracy. For macrodynamics, I would say that the left side of the SE200 easily has the best dynamics to my ears. It has pretty good macrodynamic contrast as well as weight, whereas the right side of the SE200 generally comes off as more downwards compressed because of the more downward sloping sound signature. I don't even really think the SE180 is even in the conversation. It sounds fairly flat, maybe more dynamic than say a $500 DAP, but certainly not within the realm of $1,500 good in terms of dynamics. Along these lines, I want to talk about price. My issue with these two DAPs is not that they are bad products, far from it in fact, but rather that what you're getting in terms of software and the actual sound quality is not quite commensurate with what Astell Kern is asking for them. The SE180 in particular, I cannot recommend in good faith. The software and the sound quality is just not there for $1,500. But if you're keen on purchasing an Astell Kern DAP, then I would definitely go for the SE200. It at least runs smoothly, has flagship level sound quality, and the two DAC chips means that it's going to afford you more options in terms of synergy. The benefit of the SE180, of course, is that you're going to have more options later down the line because of the modularity. But when you consider that each one of these modules is going to set you back $350 a piece, you can see that the value proposition plummets, and plummets fast at that. And in fact, I want to say that just one module is going to cost you more than the SE200 would. So I think that this is a pretty good instance of go big or go home. And yeah, I think that's going to do it for my review. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.